In 1842, China was forced to kneel. British warships sat off its coast, cannons were aimed, and the message was simple: sign or be destroyed. The result was the Treaty of Nanking, one of the most humiliating agreements ever imposed on a civilization. China was forced to pay massive reparations in silver, open its ports to foreign exploitation, surrender Hong Kong for generations. It was the beginning of what China still calls the century of humiliation. Foreign powers carved the country apart, not just with armies, but with debt, with trade, with financial control. Now fast forward to today. The irony is almost unbelievable. China, once bankrupted and bullied, now owns hundreds of billions of dollars of American debt. The former victim became the creditor. The empire that once pointed the gun now borrows the money. This is not an accident. This is not luck. This is one of the greatest long-term power reversals in modern history. And it began with a single American decision that no one thought would come back to haunt them. To understand how China ended up financing America, we need to go back to 1971. Before that year, the global financial system ran on a simple promise. Every major currency was tied to the US dollar, and the US dollar, it was tied to gold. This system, known as Bretton Woods system, made the dollar trustworthy. For every $35 in circulation, America promised it held 1 ounce of gold. Paper had weight. Money had limits. But by the 1960s, America was breaking that promise. The Vietnam War was bleeding the treasury. New social programs were expanding rapidly. America was printing dollars faster than it was producing gold. Other countries noticed, and they started calling America's bluff. France, under Charles de Gaulle, openly distrusted the dollar. French ships sailed to New York. They demanded gold, not paper. And they weren't alone. America's gold reserves began draining fast. The system was collapsing. So on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon made a decision that reshaped the world. He went on television, and he broke the promise. Nixon announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars into gold, just like that. The gold standard ended. What was meant to be temporary became permanent. From that moment on, the dollar was backed by nothing but belief. Economists call this fiat money. Its value depends entirely on trust. And America had a problem. If the dollar wasn't backed by gold anymore, why would the world keep using it? The answer came from oil. In 1974, the U.S. made a quiet but powerful deal with Saudi Arabia. America would provide military protection, weapons security guarantees in return. Saudi Arabia agreed to sell oil only in U.S. dollars, invest surplus oil money in U.S. Treasury bonds. This created the petrodollar system. Now every country on earth needed dollars, not because of gold, but because oil demanded it. America had reinvented financial gravity. Here's why the system felt unstoppable. America could import real goods, pay with printed dollars, watch those dollars return as loans. Oil producers earned dollars. They bought U.S. debt. America borrowed back its own money. It was financial alchemy. But hidden inside this genius system was a fatal weakness. America was becoming dependent on foreign creditors. As long as those creditors were allies, no problem. But history doesn't stay comfortable forever. In the late 1970s, China was devastated. Decades of rigid communist policy under Mao Zedong had left the country poor and isolated. The average Chinese citizen lived on less than $200 a year. Then a new leader took power, Deng Xiaoping, and he didn't care about ideology. He cared about results. Deng famously said, "I don't care if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice." Translation: forget dogma, get rich. He opened China to foreign trade, created special economic zones, allowed capitalism to operate under state control, but his most brilliant move was subtle. He kept China's currency cheap on purpose. When China exported goods to America, it got paid in dollars. But Chinese companies couldn't keep those dollars. The government stepped in. China's central bank took the dollars and issued yuan instead. This did two things. One, it kept Chinese exports cheap and competitive too. It flooded China with US dollars. Now China had a problem America never expected. What do you do with mountains of dollars? You lend them. China bought US Treasury bonds. At first no one panicked. China was still poor. The amount seemed manageable. American leaders even liked it. Chinese money kept US interest rates low. Consumption boomed. Manufacturing quietly moved overseas. And the imbalance grew. Year after year, America bought more from China than it sold back. The numbers exploded. 1985, $6 billion deficit. 1990, $10 billion. 2000, $83 billion. 2010, $273 billion. Every cheap TV, every toy, every piece of furniture added to China's dollar pile. And China kept lending those dollars back. Here's the loop. Americans borrowed money, bought Chinese goods. China earned dollars. China bought US debt. America borrowed again. It felt painless. Until 2008, the US housing market collapsed. Banks failed. The global economy froze. America needed massive bailouts and needed them fast, so it borrowed even more. And China kept buying, not because it trusted America, but because it couldn't afford not to. By 2011, China held over $1.3 trillion in US debt. A terrifying thought spread. What if China dumps it all? But here's the truth. China was trapped too. Selling the debt would crash bond prices, destroy China's own reserves, make Chinese exports more expensive, trigger domestic unemployment. This wasn't leverage. It was mutual assured financial destruction. China learned from this vulnerability and slowly began to pivot. They reduced treasury holdings, bought gold, funded global infrastructure, promoted the yuan internationally. By 2023, holdings dropped to $850 billion. Still huge, but declining. America's debt kept exploding. This is the real lesson. America optimized for now. China optimized for later. America consumed. China produced. America borrowed. China accumulated. One chased elections. The other chased decades. And history favors patience. America defeated the Soviet Union by outlasting it economically, then turned around and let its next rival become its banker. Not through conquest, but through shopping habits. This isn't a story of China winning or America losing. It's a story of how power really shifts, quietly, patiently, through balance sheets, not battles. And the next chapters, they're being written right now. Once Americans discovered China held over $1 trillion in US treasuries, the headlines wrote themselves. China owns America. America is in debt to its enemy. Beijing could crash the dollar tomorrow. On cable news, it was framed like a hostage situation. A villain holding a trigger. A helpless United States tied to a chair. And the phrase that spread like wildfire was this: China has a financial nuclear weapon. The idea sounded logical. If China owns a mountain of US debt, then China could sell it, flood the market, crash bond prices, force US interest rates to explode, trigger a recession, make America beg. That story is terrifying. It's also incomplete, because the weapon cuts both ways. And if China pulls the trigger, it gets hit too. Let's slow down and play the scenario like a movie. Beijing wakes up tomorrow and decides, enough. They start dumping US Treasury bonds. At first, the market notices something strange. Bond prices slip. Interest rates rise. Investors panic. Now here's the key rule: when bond prices fall, yields rise. So if China sells aggressively, the US government suddenly faces higher costs to borrow. That's the first wave. But it doesn't stop there. Because the moment China begins selling, everyone else sees the smoke. And markets don't wait for the fire. They sprint. Other countries sell too. Investors flee to other assets. The dollar falls. US borrowing costs surge. Stock markets tumble. Credit becomes expensive. Businesses freeze hiring. Consumers stop spending. You get recession momentum. That's the nightmare. But here's the hidden twist. China's own holdings collapse in value while they're selling. It's like trying to sell a house while you're setting it on fire. If China owns hundreds of billions in treasuries, those bonds are assets. Their value is based on global faith. If China tries to weaponize them, it destroys faith. And when faith collapses, the asset collapses. So China takes losses, massive losses. But that's only half the pain, because what happens when the dollar weakens? Chinese exports become more expensive to Americans. That means U.S. retailers place fewer orders, Chinese factories slow down, workers get laid off, local unrest rises. China's economy is built on stability. The Chinese government fears one thing above all else: mass unemployment, because unemployment creates anger, and anger threatens control. So dumping treasuries isn't a clean weapon. It's a grenade in a locked room. Sure, you can throw it, but you're trapped inside with it. That's why serious economists compare the U.S.-China debt relationship to something chilling. Not a weapon, but a mutual hostage pact. Picture two rivals standing at the edge of a cliff. Each is holding the other's shirt. If one lets go, both fall. This is the strange reality of modern power. America depends on Chinese manufacturing capacity, Chinese purchases of treasuries, China's role in global supply chains. China depends on American consumers, the dollar's stability, access to U.S. markets and technology. They threaten each other. They insult each other. They spy on each other. But they're locked in the same financial room. And they can't agree on peace, but they also can't afford divorce. So what does China do instead? Something smarter, something slower, something far more dangerous long-term. It doesn't attack the system directly. It builds exits. After 2008, China began acting like a prisoner who realized the cell door might open, but only if they stop rattling the bars and start building a tunnel. So they began a long-term plan. Step 1. Reduce dependency on U.S. debt. They slowly cut treasury holdings over time. Not enough to panic markets, but enough to shift exposure. Step 2. Stockpile alternatives. They bought more gold. They expanded foreign currency reserves. They diversified into real assets. Step 3. Build influence abroad. They didn't just save money. They deployed money through infrastructure loans, ports, railways, power plants, under one giant strategy. The Belt and Road Initiative. China was turning dollar reserves into geopolitical gravity, not by crashing America, but by creating a world where America is no longer unavoidable. Here's where people get confused. They assume debt makes America weak, but America has one cheat code no other nation has. It borrows in its own currency. If a smaller nation borrows in dollars and can't pay, it collapses. But America can always print. The Federal Reserve can always buy treasuries. That makes default unlikely. So in theory, the U.S. can carry debt far longer than other countries. That's why the system hasn't imploded yet. But here's the catch. Printing money is not free. You pay in different currency. Inflation, asset bubbles, inequality, distorted markets, political instability. The bill still arrives. It just arrives quietly, like carbon monoxide. So if China can't own America through treasuries, what's the real danger? The real danger isn't that China can crash America overnight. The real danger is that America has grown addicted to cheap imports, cheap borrowing, living beyond production, and China has grown skilled at exploiting that addiction. Debt doesn't act like a bomb. Debt acts like gravity. It pulls slowly, but it never stops pulling. And over decades, gravity reshapes everything. This is the difference that explains the entire story. America borrowed to consume. China accumulated to build. America spent trillions on wars with unclear returns, short-term political wins, consumption-driven growth. Meanwhile, China used surpluses to build industrial capacity, infrastructure, ports and logistics, high-speed rail, manufacturing ecosystems. One side turned money into comfort. The other turned money into capability. And capability is power. People talk about debt like it's an accounting problem, But debt is political. Debt shapes decisions. When you owe someone, you calculate consequences. You hesitate. You weigh risk. And for the first time in modern history, America is in a position it hates. It has to think about its rivals' reaction when making policy. Not always, not openly, but subtly, strategically. And when power shifts subtly, it's almost invisible until it isn't. Here's the kind of question nobody answers directly. If a real crisis erupts over Taiwan, would America act the same way if it wasn't financially intertwined? Maybe yes, maybe no, but the entanglement adds friction. It adds hesitation. It adds invisible cost. Even if China can't dump treasuries as a weapon, the relationship itself creates constraints, and that's the point. Power isn't only what you can do. Power is what you can make others hesitate to do. So China stopped trying to attack America directly. Instead, it began creating a world where the dollar is less dominant. How? By making countries trade without it, deals in yuan, currency swap agreements, energy purchases in non-dollar terms, gold-backed settlement discussions, slow moves, quiet moves, but the goal is obvious. A world where the United States can't print prosperity forever because the world no longer needs its paper. Right now, the system still works. America still sells treasuries. The world still buys them. The dollar still dominates. But the trend lines matter more than the headlines. China is slowly reducing exposure. America is still adding debt. This creates a long-term collision course. If global confidence in U.S. debt weakens, America must pay higher interest. Higher interest means higher budget pressure. Higher budget pressure means harder political choices. And America hates hard choices. That's the cliff edge. Not a dramatic sell-off, not a sudden weapon, but a slow tightening vice. When the dollar became dominant after World War II, it wasn't because it was fair. It was because Europe was destroyed. America held most of the world's gold. U.S. industry dominated global production. The U.S. Navy controlled shipping lanes. The dollar became the safest place to park value. And once everyone uses the same currency, switching becomes incredibly hard. This is why reserve currencies don't fall quickly. They rot slowly. From the inside, no reserve currency collapses overnight. They follow a pattern. First, overconfidence; second, overissuance; third, debt dependence; fourth, loss of discipline; fifth, alternatives emerge. The British pound followed this path. So did the Dutch guilder. So did the Spanish silver system. Each empire believed it was different. Each was wrong. Reserve currencies don't die because someone attacks them. They die because the issuing country abuses the privilege. Ending the gold standard gave America flexibility. It also removed restraint. After 1971, there was no natural limit on money creation, only political limits, and political limits are weak. Every crisis became solvable with debt. Every war became financeable. Every recession could be delayed. The bill was always pushed forward. And as long as the world kept buying treasuries, there was no immediate consequence. This created an illusion that borrowing was harmless, that deficits didn't matter, that America had escaped history. China didn't just stumble into its position. They studied imperial rise and collapse obsessively. They studied Britain. They studied America. They studied the Soviet Union. And they learned one core lesson. Empires don't fall from military defeat first. They fall from financial exhaustion. So China didn't challenge America with tanks. They challenged it with spreadsheets. The petrodollar system worked because oil producers accepted dollars, not because they loved America, but because America provided security. As long as U.S. military power protected shipping lanes and regimes, the deal held. But the deal had an expiration date built into it. What happens when oil is no longer king? And what happens when oil producers want options? Over the last decade, energy markets changed. Renewables expanded, natural gas reshaped trade, new producers entered the market, old producers lost leverage, and suddenly, Oil exporters started asking uncomfortable questions. Why should we hold so many dollars? Why should we accept political risk tied to U.S. policy? Why not diversify? That question alone weakened the foundation. This is where China moved quietly. Instead of attacking the dollar head-on, they offered alternatives. Bilateral trade deals settled in local currencies. Energy purchases priced in yuan. Currency swap lines that bypass the dollar entirely. These weren't revolutionary moves. They were incremental, but reserve currency erosion always starts incrementally. You don't need everyone to leave. You only need some. Sanctions are one of America's most powerful tools, but they come with a cost. Every time the U.S. freezes assets, every time it cuts someone off from the dollar system, every time it weaponizes finance, other countries take notes. They ask, what if we're next? And when that fear spreads, they look for exits. Sanctions protect power in the short term. They erode it in the long term. When the U.S. froze foreign reserves in recent geopolitical crises, it sent shockwaves through central banks worldwide. For the first time, holding dollar reserves felt political, not neutral, not safe. And reserve currency status depends on perceived neutrality. Once that's gone, trust erodes. Here's the mistake most people make. They think reserve currency collapse looks like hyperinflation, like wheelbarrows of cash, like Weimar Germany. That's unlikely. The real danger is gradual irrelevance. The dollar can remain strong while being used less. And if fewer transactions require dollars, then fewer countries need to hold them, which means fewer buyers of U.S. debt. That's the quiet danger. If global demand for treasuries weakens, interest rates rise, debt servicing costs explode, budget deficits worsen, political pressure intensifies, America doesn't collapse, but it loses flexibility. Every policy choice becomes harder. Every crisis becomes more painful. Debt stops being invisible. A crash forces reform. A slow squeeze doesn't. A slow squeeze creates resentment, polarization, denial, extremism. People feel poorer without understanding why. They blame each other, not the system. That's how empires rot internally. Here's the twist. China doesn't need the yuan to replace the dollar. It just needs the dollar to lose monopoly power. Multipolar currency systems reduce U.S. leverage. They don't need to win. They just need America to lose exclusivity. That's a much easier objective. People say, just bring manufacturing back. Just cut spending. Just raise taxes. Each solution is politically radioactive. Bringing manufacturing back raises prices. Cutting spending angers voters. Raising taxes loses elections. So the system defaults to inertia. And inertia favors whoever planned ahead. China thinks in decades. America thinks in quarters. This isn't a moral judgment, it's structural. Democracies struggle with long-term sacrifice. Authoritarian systems struggle with flexibility. Both systems have limits, but in slow financial contests, patience is power. Americans often ask, why do we care who owns our debt? The answer isn't control, it's confidence. Debt reflects trust, and trust is cumulative. When trust declines slowly, people don't panic. They adjust. They hedge. They diversify. Until one day, the system feels different. Central banks increasing gold reserves, trade settled outside dollars, rising treasury yields, political dysfunction over debt ceilings, none of these alone are catastrophic. Together, they tell a story of gradual transition. The fall of reserve currencies isn't dramatic. And the final chapter of this story isn't about China winning. It's about whether America adapts or clings to a system that no longer bends. Empires don't collapse when they're weak. They collapse when they're exhausted. When the tools that once made problems disappear, money, debt, influence, stop working the way they used to. For decades, America solved every crisis the same way: borrow more, print more, delay consequences. It worked because the world allowed it to work, but no privilege lasts forever. There is a single moment every debt-driven empire fears. Not default, not collapse, but rising interest rates. Because rising rates don't destroy you instantly. They bleed you slowly. When interest costs rise, defense budgets compete with debt payments, social programs face cuts, infrastructure investment stalls, political compromise vanishes, every dollar serves the past instead of the future. At first, interest payments feel abstract. Then they become dominant. When a nation spends more on servicing old debt than educating its children, that's not a fiscal issue. That's a civilizational one. This is where decline becomes structural, not dramatic but irreversible without pain. No politician campaigns on austerity. No leader wins by saying, we must consume less. We must grow slower. We must sacrifice. So denial becomes policy. Debt ceilings become theater. Spending continues. Borrowing continues. The illusion holds until it doesn't. Decline doesn't feel like collapse, it feels like frustration, anger, confusion. People sense something is wrong but can't agree on why, so they fight each other, not the system. That's when polarization explodes. That's when trust evaporates. That's when democracies weaken from the inside. Rome didn't fall when barbarians crossed the border. It fell when it could no longer pay its legions. Spain didn't fall when silver ran out. It fell when debt consumed its revenue. Britain didn't fall after losing wars. It fell after debt from 2 world wars hollowed its empire. The pattern is always financial first, political later, military last. The United States still has advantages: innovation, talent, universities, capital markets, cultural influence, but advantages must be maintained. They decay without investment, and investment requires discipline. Adaptation is painful. It means accepting higher prices, reshoring production, slowly raising taxes or cutting spending, investing in infrastructure instead of consumption, thinking in decades, not elections. This path preserves sovereignty, but it demands honesty. Decline is easier. It means more borrowing, more division, more denial, more blame, less reform. This path preserves comfort for now, but it trades the future for the present. China is not immune. They face demographic collapse, internal debt bubbles, innovation, constraints, political rigidity, but they understand one thing clearly: power flows to producers, not consumers. That belief shapes every long-term decision they make. This is not about China replacing America. History doesn't crown new emperors cleanly. It fragments power. It decentralizes influence. The future is likely multipolar, messy, competitive, unstable. The most dangerous moment for any empire is believing it's still exceptional, believing the rules don't apply, believing decline only happens to others. That belief delays reform, and delay compounds damage. Debt is a symptom. The real problem is what debt financed: consumption instead of capacity, short-term comfort instead of long-term strength. Borrowing isn't evil. Borrowing without purpose is. America once defeated rivals by forcing them into unsustainable spending. Now it risks doing the same to itself, not by enemies, but by habit. Empires fall, but nations adapt. The United States has reinvented itself before. After the Great Depression, after World War II, after the Cold War, reinvention is possible, but only if reality is faced. This story isn't about revenge. It's about memory. China remembered humiliation. America forgot discipline. History rewards memory and punishes amnesia. 2 centuries ago, China was forced to kneel. 1 century ago, America rose unrivaled. Today, both stand locked together, not by war, not by ideology, but by debt. The future won't be decided by bombs or speeches. It will be decided by balance sheets, by patience, by restraint, and by whether societies can tell themselves the truth before reality does it for them. Because history is merciless. It does not care who you were, only who you are willing to become. Thank you for watching. If you want to understand how economies rise and fall, how wealth is created and destroyed, and what history's greatest cautionary tales teach us about our own time, make sure to subscribe. These patterns repeat, and understanding them might be the most valuable knowledge you can possess. We'll see you in the next one.